Hi guys, I want to say a few words today about narcissists on the down low and winkling out Mr. or Ms. Narcissist if we can, early on preferably. And I want to say just a few words today about that because as far as our safe relationship training is concerned and our happiness, let's face it, we want to be as sure as possible when we meet someone on that date or in that relationship that we may be thinking about going into, that we're going into a relationship with someone who is really compatible with us and is a safe and a healthy option and one that is going to make us both mutually happy. So one of the issues with narcissism that I want to pick up first, which is quite a good, in my experience, identification factor, is that it can pop up quite early on in the interaction. And I've often been surprised at how early this behaviour does pop up. And then I was shown, if you will, that it's really to do with people being that way in every situation that they're in, and they've become habitualized into certain behaviours, and those behaviours will often be shown really early on, possibly in the first interaction. And so when we get used to using conscious awareness and we get used to using observation skills and listening well and knowing which sort of factors to keep an eye out for, it can become easier and easier to be able to identify various unhealthy dynamics that can pop up, as I say, sometimes in the first interaction. So that's number one point really, is to say that when we have practice at having a keen awareness of what is happening before us, and we're used to being able to identify the signs of particular unhealthy dynamics early on, it can get easier and easier, and our safe relationship toolbox can start to build up. And we've got a nice little store box there of abilities and skills that we can use automatically when we're engaging with other people, and particularly when we're looking for or making ourselves available on the dating scene for the appropriate partner. And so with the narcissists in our lives, the down low behaviour sometimes is hidden, sometimes it's not apparent, particularly if we're not aware of various aspects to the narcissistic dynamic. And it's that lack of awareness that actually trips a lot of people up. But as I said earlier, when we do get used to practicing identifying various unhealthy dynamics, it gets a lot easier and it's not so much hard work. So down low behaviour, of course, as the name suggests, can be under the radar and out of our awareness, particularly if we're not aware of what to look for anyway. And so, which is where you get the nice persona and what have you coming forth early on. And very narcissistic people do present themselves at an initial meeting through quite subtle ways sometimes. And those subtle identifications are the ones to look out for with covert narcissists, whether that's a man or a woman. And so often they're not always aware of their narcissism, and we're all capable of having very narcissistic tendencies. It's just whether we're aware of that or not, and we want to temper them down, or which aspects we want to sort of build up in our lives. So, we don't come to our dealings with other people with a judgmental attitude, because we all need to temper and monitor our own narcissistic tendencies with other people. But in the dating scene, sometimes you will find that there are some markers, and particularly in the initial dynamics, you may find criticism of other people, situations, or us coming forth quite early on. And criticism and perfectionist styles is quite a strong marker in my experience with very narcissistic people anyway. And the lack of empathy, I think, is tied in with that criticism. So that those subtle ways that identification markers can come through are often indicators of a critical person in general, because they've become habitualized to naturally just allowing their mind and their thoughts to go down that critical route. And so in my experience, if someone has been overtly critical of others and judgmental in an early interaction, generally that criticism and that judgmental attitude somewhere down the line could be aimed at us as well. So in the initial stages, as I've mentioned elsewhere, it's good to take an objective stance where we stand back and we look at this person objectively without judgment, and log in our safe relationship diary or log just what we're seeing and hearing, so that we can look at it later and we can see if that behaviour gets worse or if it starts to be aimed at us. And usually, if there is an abusive dynamic that's being set up, it usually begins with emotional, psychological and verbal abuse to begin with, so that the partner is groomed before it escalates usually to either sexual or physical abuse, as is many times the case. So I like to highlight not being worried as we go out in the dating scene or go into our relationships, but to just be very consciously aware and to make conscious choices based on solid evidence, as it were, and also based on our internal warning system, our intuition, and our knowing in a spiritual sense about this person, so that we can build up these tools in our safe relationship toolbox. And so covert narcissistic people can be a little bit tricky to winkle out, but in a covert narcissism, we find that it's subtle there at the beginning, and it's that subtlety that we can pick up on, and also use our spirituality in order to energetically pick up on where that person is coming from spiritually, and their worldview, how they view the world in general, and their position in it, and other people's position in it as well. And with very narcissistic people, often their worldview includes other people being not as good as they are, of being of a lower order to them. So that sense also will come through. That sense of one-upmanship will possibly come through, and that egotism will possibly come through very early on in the interactions as well. So, as I say, these are notes we can put in our safe relationship diary or log for later, and we can look at the patterns that we see they're forming regarding this person, subtle patterns and overt patterns as well. Look at the levels of criticism and their perception of the world and their position in it, as far as whether they believe themselves to be better than other people. And just make a note of the subtlety that may be presenting themselves, and their criticism towards former partners, for instance, and how they feel about that, and what sort of feelings you can sense coming through regarding that situation and that partner, so that you get a sense really of the person as a whole. However subtle that may come across, we can still sense it on an energetic level within here. So, I hope that's helpful, and I just wanted to highlight today looking at subtle indications with covert narcissists, because we may be presented with a facade and persona which actually is the complete opposite of what may actually turn up further down the line. And just to be aware, as far as covert narcissism is concerned, that it may turn up in a very subtle form initially. So as always, stay safe and very happy. Bye bye.